Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon and welcome to Reproaction's Act and Learn webinar for November 2023. We are very excited to discuss this important topic with a kick-ass panel. Today's topic is also pretty heavy. They're trying to ban travel for abortion seekers. It's true. All right, first we'll introduce hosts. The first voice you're hearing is Erin Matson. Hello, I use she, her pronouns, and I'm co-founder, president, and CEO of Reproaction. I'm based in Washington, D.C., and I'm Erin to the max on social.
And my name is Shireen Shakori. I use she and her pronouns. I'm executive vice president and chief of staff here at Reproaction, and I am also based in Washington, D.C.
Awesome, thanks, Shireen. I am gonna just walk us through our agenda before we dive in. First, we'll introduce Reproaction if you got here through means other than our organization and don't know who we are. Then we'll do a topic overview and introduction to it. And then we'll dive into our panel discussion with experts. We're really excited to be joined by Lindsay London of the Amarillo Reproductive Freedom Alliance, Rosann Mariapurram with the State Innovation Exchange, and Andrea Grimes, an activist and writer. And then we'll move to next steps and go to Q&A. If you are on social and you live tweet, hashtag Reproaction makes it easy for us to see you and retweet you. But however you choose to engage, we're just thrilled that you're here. Also, one other note of housekeeping before I share our organization. If you have questions at any point in the presentation, whether it's for Shireen or myself or any of our esteemed panelists, Lindsay, Rosann, and Andrea, you can just put them into the questions tab and we'll get to as many as possible at the end. So you don't have to wait to the end to put those in. Okay, a bit about Reproaction. We lead bold action to increase access to abortion and advance reproductive justice. We're extremely proud of our left flank analysis. We're known for our willingness to hold folks on all sides of the issue accountable to increasing access to abortion and advancing reproductive justice, whether they're traditionally considered allies or opposition. And we have a commitment to nonviolent direct action as one of the tools in our toolbox. And with that, I will pass it over to Shireen.
Thanks so much. So I'm going to be fairly brief so that we can get to our amazing panel. But first, I just wanted to lay out what abortion access looks like right now. And I provided this map thanks to Guttmacher Institute. It is up to date as of the 22nd of this month. So not much has changed since then with the holiday and everything, but that just goes to show how fluid the abortion access landscape is right now, and unfortunately how dire it is in some places. You can see this is sort of a heat map style where the warmer red, orange, yellow colors are the most restrictive, and then the cooler tones are more protective of abortion access. And looking at this map, you can tell that there are broad swaths of the country where abortion access is in that most restrictive plane, and also that they are concentrated together, and that people in those areas would have to subsequently travel really far to get the care that they need, in some cases across multiple time zones to get the care they need, which is obviously a pretty dire situation. So I don't give all this background to bring anyone down in this already frustrating topic, but I just wanted to set the scene of what we are talking about. But there is some hope, because you can see practical support networks exist also around the country in more places than abortion is very restrictive. This map is from Apiary, which connects practical support organizations, and they are groups that help people get to that care. So they provide various forms of support so that people can get the abortions they need, including if they have to travel, miss work, get lodging, etc., to get that care. You can see that it covers a lot of the parts of the country that have the lowest access, and also some places where access is considered high as well. So great work from practical support organizations, but there is complexity in our topic today that we are presented. Next slide. So I just included a few clips from news over the past couple years, highlighting some of the places where laws have been proposed or ordinances that would have restricted access to abortion. So we're seeing Idaho, there was talk of laws to prevent abortion trafficking that did end up becoming signed. In Texas, there's a couple different ordinances and bills proposed at different levels of government that would have banned travel for abortion seekers, and we're going to talk more about that in a minute. And then Missouri as well, I believe, was one of the first proposals we saw as early as, I think, late 2022, where a Missouri state legislator was planning to criminalize people seeking abortion out of state. That raised a lot of questions. We're going to get into those questions, the implications, and what's actually happening on the ground with our panel. So I'll kick it back to you, Erin, to start us off there.
Thank you so much for grounding this discussion, Shireen, in the reality of abortion access in the United States today. It really makes clear how dire the situation is, and also the repercussions of the fact that the travel bans are being proposed. So first, I'm going to introduce our panelist, number one of the afternoon, Lindsay London, who uses she, her pronouns. We're so thrilled to have Lindsay. She's a registered nurse and one of the co-founders of the Amarillo Reproductive Freedom Alliance, which is a network of individuals, businesses, and community organizations which act civically and politically to protect reproductive freedom in the Texas Panhandle. Go Lindsay. Lindsay has been committed to advocating for marginalized communities through organizing and activism since her early teen years. She's been an RN since 2009 and has extensive experience in the fields of reproductive sexual health, pediatrics, and chronic care management. Her career in nursing provides a care-centered approach that catalyzes her activism and collaboration with others, and we urge you to connect further with Amarillo RJ work on social media. So those links are on the screen. Lindsay, welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for having me.
So let's dive right in. Oh my goodness. Who's behind the proposed abortion travel bans in your area, and what are they trying to do?
Okay, so there are two men who are primarily responsible for these ordinances, and I'd like to tell you guys a little bit about both of them. The first is Jonathan Mitchell. He is the lawyer who drafts the ordinances, and the second is Mark Lee Dixon. He is more of the boots on the ground who solicits city and county officials regarding these ordinances. So who is Jonathan Mitchell? He is the covert legal muscle that's working behind Dixon. He's a former Solicitor General of Texas, and Mitchell wrote the civil action or the bounty hunter law component of the Texas Heartbeat Bill, or SB 8, which has been in place since September 1st of 2021. This is the law that allows Texans to pursue civil suits against people who they accuse of aiding or abetting abortion. And he has cruelly pioneered the idea of allowing private citizens to file lawsuits worth up to tens of thousands of dollars against anyone they suspect of being involved in abortion access. So our research finds that his lawsuits are purposefully written to be vague, so that when cities are inevitably sued, as we have seen that they are, he then offers his legal services to these city governments at no charge. And in fact, he has preemptively offered to represent the city of Amarillo pro bono if that were to arise here following the passage of an ordinance. Our organization sees his long-term strategy as getting these ordinances to state or federal Supreme Courts to change laws and push his anti-abortion extremist agenda. It's also important to note that Judge Kaczmarek, who is overseeing the mifepristone case, as well as the DeAnda case, which stripped away teens' rights to access to birth control without parental consent last year, is based in Amarillo. And guess who the lawyer is arguing the DeAnda case before Kaczmarek? You guessed it, Jonathan Mitchell. So Amarillo has become a hub of sorts for some of the most pivotal reproductive justice arguments since Roe, which really makes our work against this ordinance here in our hometown feel all the more important and crucial. So then on to Mark Lee Dixon. Oof, he is a thorn in our side. He is the executive director of the Sanctuary Cities for the Unborn and the Right to Life East Texas. He is a self-proclaimed 36-year-old virgin and a pastor, though we have never been able to identify training of clergy affiliation for him. Mark's stated life work is to fully outlaw and criminalize abortion, and his work with the ordinances began several years ago. He has his eyes heavily set on Amarillo, as we are the gateway from the tip of Texas to New Mexico and Colorado, which are crucial access points for all of Texas to still be able to get abortion services. Mark has not been successful in every town that he has visited, but to date, a total of 5 cities and 2 counties have passed his so-called Sanctuary for the Unborn ordinances. We prefer to call them barrier city ordinances. Recently, Llano, Texas and Athens, Texas rejected their proposed ordinances. 2 towns have now successfully repealed. Some have gotten them rewritten and weakened, but he overall has been broadly successful targeting Republican-led all-male city councils. Mark strategically waited until our leadership changed this year to strike again in Amarillo. He did attempt presenting the ordinance with previous leadership, but was not successful. It's also important to note that via his social media, he states that he is now living in Amarillo to work to get the ordinance passed, so the heat is on. And that summarizes them.
Oh my goodness. Thank you for that extremely comprehensive walkthrough. And there's something I want to underscore as a general principle at Reproaction. We do extremely direct work to blunt and end the harms of the anti-abortion movement. And I just want to underscore, because what Lindsay just outlined is a perfect example of how coordinated and calculated and strategic this authoritarian movement to end access to abortion care is at the community, state, and national level in this country. And it just brought a chill down my spine, Lindsay, to hear even, and it doesn't surprise me at all that, for example, waiting to take action until the midst of a leadership change in the opposition. So just want to underscore the nature of what we're up against here and why it's so serious and needs to be taken seriously. I'm going to pivot to another question. One of the things about these travel bans, I'll just say as an aside, like I often find myself saying these days that I came into this fight as someone who is working for gender justice and reproductive justice, and I realize now that much of this work is also just fighting for democracy and the Constitution and Basic Bill of Rights. On this question of trying to bar access to travel, right, for abortion seekers, I was like, well, wait a minute, isn't that just flat out unconstitutional, right? So my question for you is, like, take us back a step and widen the lens. What could travel restrictions related to abortion mean for freedom of travel generally? And then also just being cognizant, like, how could this impact immigrant communities specifically, given the suspicion that's already placed on travel within immigrant communities?
No, 100%. I mean, you hit the nail on the head. And one of the most important pieces that we like to point out and that we continually remind our city council of is that the right to interstate travel is protected by the Constitution. So ultimately, the goal is to instill fear and then create a dangerous platform for after the fact consequences. These ordinances work to strictly prohibit, these ordinances, they prohibit the person who obtained the abortion from being penalized, but rather anyone else who helps them travel for legal out-of-state services. And we understand that the impact that this could have on immigrant communities is severe. In Texas, there is already dangerous rhetoric and policies impacting immigrant communities, and Amarillo is no different. But it's important to note that Amarillo is a refugee relocation center, and we are home to many diverse nationalities and cultures. And immigrant labor is a key piece of many industries in our region. We know that these communities are already underserved and lack equitable access to healthcare, and travel bans will create even more fear and barriers to access abortion care if and when it's needed. One example of that is that, undocumented folks without a driver's license would need support to travel across state lines for services. And the threats from these ordinances place them and those who help them in harm's way. Not to mention that the bounty framework of the ordinance could galvanize those who already hold anti-immigrant and racist viewpoints to harm our immigrant and refugee neighbors for seeking care. So lots and lots to take into consideration of how it could impact those communities.
What a nightmare.
Yeah.
There's really, what else can be said? It's a nightmare. Lindsay, my last question for you, I'm going to make it a two-part question. One, I want to hear how activists on the ground are resisting these infringements on constitutional rights, human rights, basic rights. Also, being cognizant that we have a ton of people on the line who are listening, who are activists, who are not necessarily activists on the ground, but they want to help support you and the work that activists on the ground are doing. Both how are activists on the ground resisting, and how can activists who are not on the ground best support those activists on the ground?
Sure, thank you. So what started all this back in July of this year, some reproductive justice activists in our town were alerted to a meeting that was being held at Trinity Fellowship Church here in Amarillo that was being put on by Mark Lee Dixon. So myself and one other attended this meeting to see what was going on. We sat there for 2 hours, and what we learned really shocked us and definitely motivated us to take action. So following that meeting, several members of our existing activist network formed ARFA, the Amarillo Reproductive Freedom Alliance, and we have been really working tirelessly ever since. We engage with local businesses to explain our platform and why it matters for them. We've gathered hundreds of like-minded individuals, sympathetic clergy, as well as other community organizations with similar guideposts. So we're very proud to represent the true diversity of Amarillo and not the opinions of, our 5 men, mayor and city council, who have all stated that they are staunchly anti-abortion. So part of our work is that we have requested a lot of PIAs, public information access requests, to determine if and what type of communication our elected leaders have had with Dixon and Mitchell. We attend every city council meeting. We have, at this point, met privately with the mayor and all but one city councilman. We're meeting with the other this week just to build that rapport and really make them aware that we're watching and we're ready to take action against it. We had one city council meeting that was on October 24th where they did bring the agenda item as a discussion item. There has been no formal action, no vote, nothing like that has happened in Amarillo yet. But we were so proud. We mobilized over 25 members of our community to speak, and hundreds more have written letters and emails, and we filled over half of the chamber with our supporters. It was over 5.5 hours of discussion that night. So in addition, we're coordinating with statewide and national organizations that are helping us strategize and amplify our message. And we keep our email list and our social media updated with all of the information we receive. So really the best way, is to follow us on our socials. We have a link tree there where folks can get on our email list. We're slowly building, the capacity for donations to help. We're completely volunteer led. And so for those who don't feel as comfortable forward facing, there's always the opportunity to write letters and make calls and just simply spreading awareness. Amarillo is just one of what we suspect to be the towns in the Panhandle that they are going to target. And rural areas don't have the same kind of, activist network and things. So really just making folks aware So they're not able to come in a clandestine way and pass this without people, being knowledgeable of the impacts. Is really some of the best ways that we can try and stay ahead of this.
Oh, Lindsay, you are a total rock star. That's amazing. That Amarillo Reproductive Freedom Alliance is all volunteer run, and you're packing meetings, making them go long. I mean, this is outstanding work. So,
well, thank you. I am just one of many. We have a team of fierce and intelligent and just diligent folks that we're working with. And so, we call ourselves a non-hierarchical organization, and we could not exist without the work of every member.
Oh, I believe it. That is awesome work, and kudos to all of you. Thank you so much for joining us, Lindsay. So if anyone has questions for Lindsay, I'm sure you do, just put them in the questions tab. We'll get to as many as possible at the end. I'm now going to pass it back to Shireen.
Thanks so much. And I'm thrilled to introduce our next speaker, Rosann Mariapurram, who is Senior Policy Counsel at Reproductive Rights at State Innovation Exchange. SIX is a national resource and strategy center that helps state legislators improve people's lives through transformative public policy. Prior to joining SIX, Rosann served as Executive Director of Jane's Due Process, a nonprofit that helps anyone under 18 in Texas confidentially access abortion and birth control and fights for young people's bodily autonomy. Rosann has served on the boards of Equality Texas, NARAL Pro-Choice Texas, and the Lilith Fund for Reproductive Equity. She received her JD from University of Texas School of Law, MA in International Relations from City College of New York, and BA from NYU. Rosann is originally from Cleveland and is a proud daughter of immigrant parents. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a thrill to be here.
Okay, I will get to the first question. So I teased it earlier on, but where other than Amarillo are abortion travel bans being proposed, and what's being done to fight back at the legal level?
So I feel like I'm going to spend a lot of this just plus oneing things Lindsay said about how this is all orchestrated by sort of the same two folks. And so when we think about where else it's being proposed, it's in places where people are traveling to obtain abortion care. So for example, in Danville, Illinois, which, I think a lot of folks think statewide of Illinois is a place where abortion is accessible, but in this town, they passed a abortion travel restriction that also included basically a local version of the Comstock law, which is an attempt to ban the mailing of abortion pills. And Illinois has become a haven for people who are traveling out of the South and the Southeast and are seeking abortion care. So I won't mention any of the Texas places where it has been passed, but I wanted to really highlight that this is happening outside of Texas and is happening in states with protective abortion access. However, on the flip of that, these types of laws have been introduced but stopped in places like Quincy, Illinois. And once again, to plus one Lindsay, this is the work of the local advocates and the organizations on the ground who saw this effort. And it's Mark Lee Dickinson, it's Jonathan Mitchell, it's the same folks. So this is not coming from local communities. This is part of a targeted attempt to focus on going to states like Illinois, which are becoming a source of abortion access and really trying to restrict travel. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much for that. And it is so important that folks in, those places that are perceived as quote unquote safe for abortion access to understand that safe is only as true as long as we rest on our laurels and aren't continually finding ways to be offensive against potential attacks and defensive from when they happen. So kind of related to that, is there a notable difference you've seen in how these bans are being proposed, either from, the Texas versus the Illinois, or the more local to the state level? Or is the anti-abortion movement kind of using the same playbook everywhere just to see what sticks? We've seen them use both strategies, so I'm curious how it's playing out here.
Yeah, so I'm going to use a couple of court cases as an example of how it's different or how it's the same. So first, I would say this is a a strategy that they definitely used with the SB 8 mechanism. So these local ordinances started as those sanctuary city bans that Lindsay mentioned, and that was really starting in 2020 and contained these civil enforcement mechanisms. And I think the strategy that became very clear was once they got enough of them passed on the local level in Texas, they introduced them as a state law in SB 8, which then passed into law. And the mechanism of civil enforcement prohibits or really makes it challenging to file a lawsuit preventing these laws from taking effect. And the reason for that is you don't have a state official or a government entity that you can sue because the law is being enforced by a private individual. And I think that is very common in all of the ordinances around travel bans that have been introduced in Texas and outside of Texas. So it's once again using private lawsuits to enforce the law, making it hard to sue. They also, to my knowledge, and I'm always willing to be wrong because I think these are popping up so quickly, but they don't apply to the pregnant person. So the focus is really on attacking anyone who's helping. And so that's those practical support networks we discussed. It's also, a family member or a friend who's maybe driving someone or, really trying to support their family member's decision. And I think that similarity is throughout. The variations is kind of what else do they also include. So the travel bans, I would say, are definitely a sort of post-Dobbs creation. The focus on Comstock and banning pills kind of was almost directly tied to the FDA mifepristone case that we're seeing work its way through the federal court systems. It's already pinged up to the Supreme Court and now is kind of, in the Fifth Circuit. So I think that piece, so tying in a travel ban ordinance with a restriction on mailing pills, that's just showing that they're trying to kind of hit at any level. So they've already got a federal court case moving on whether or not Comstock should exist or apply, and they're trying to work it into these local ordinances. And it's really an effort to try to normalize these horribly extreme laws. So I can kind of just walk through a couple of the cases that are dealing with these bans, and I hope that'll give good information. So the first one I'll focus on is definitely in Idaho over the as it's been called, the abortion trafficking bill, that really is an attempt to restrict travel for minors. Once again, that law attempts to criminalize or hurt the people who are helping, and so it doesn't necessarily attack the pregnant young person who's under the age of 18. So a lawsuit was filed to try to prevent that law from taking effect, and that case is Matsumoto v. Labrador. And the federal district court did grant a preliminary injunction on November 8th, which means that that law is not in effect as of the 8th. However, in the past week, the Idaho Attorney General has appealed that preliminary injunction up to the Ninth Circuit and asked for it to be revoked. But as we currently talk, that law is enjoined. Something to keep in mind about Idaho is also that they have ongoing litigation around their full abortion ban, and it's also being litigated by the Idaho Attorney General. And in that case, at least, the Ninth Circuit, has been ruling on the side of abortion seekers and providers when it's en banc, so when it's the entire Ninth Circuit. However, like many federal courts, the Ninth Circuit has become more conservative over the past several years as more conservative judges were appointed. So that's kind of where the Idaho restriction is right now on minor travel. The other litigation I kind of wanted to highlight was in New Mexico. In the state of New Mexico, the Board of County Commissioners for Lee County. And this is kind of an interesting case, I thought, because similar to in Texas, some counties and cities passed sanctuary city bans prior to the Dobbs decision, kind of anticipating the fall of Roe. However, quickly after Dobbs, the state legislature passed New Mexico's Reproductive and Gender Affirming Healthcare Freedom Act, which took effect. And because it took effect, that allowed advocates to sue over the sanctuary city bans, and the New Mexico Supreme Court actually, stayed the impact of those local ordinances and now has oral arguments in the case coming up on December 13th. So that really shows the power of legislative change and legislative work against these sort of constant overflow of these sanctuary city bans. But when you can pass a comprehensive reproductive health act to protect people, it can be used to sort of keep these bans at bay. And then the last two I want to name are out of Alabama. So there were two lawsuits that were filed in Alabama seeking clarification over that state's abortion ban, including whether or not folks could get criminalized for making abortion referrals to places out of state or helping someone travel out of state. And so that consolidated case is Yellowhammer Fund v. Attorney General of Alabama. An important thing in that case is the U.S. Department of Justice filed a position in the case. So they didn't join the case, but they filed documentation that says they firmly believe in the federal protected right to travel. And that's kind of like signaling basically to the court that like we're going to come down on the side of the providers and the abortion fund if this goes further. And so I thought that was important. That case is moving, which, you know, each circuit is more or less conservative, and in Alabama's case, they might be dealing with a more conservative court. And then the last case is really one that I'll name I was part of when I was at James Due Process, and that is Fund Texas Choice v. Paxton. So this was actually filed by abortion funds and a provider, similarly to seek clarification over whether they could face a variety of charges, criminal and civil, over helping people leave the state to seek abortion care. And similarly, that district court granted a preliminary injunction in Texas preventing prosecutions for those provider and abortion funds who filed their lawsuit. The case is could still work its way up the courts, but I think time and again we're seeing sort of like federal courts affirming this right to travel and this sort of refusal to apply abortion bans extraterritorially or across a state line to behavior that happens completely out of the state. And I just wanted to shout that, you know, I'm a lawyer, so I always talk about lawsuits, but other ways to kind of fight back that we're seeing on these bans is things like in this past month, Senator Nate Johnson introduced SB 4 in Texas, which it seeks to prohibit local travel bans from being passed in the state. And that's definitely a reaction to everything that we just discussed. And then in Ohio, the National Association of Social Workers and the Abortion Fund of Ohio had filed a lawsuit over local ordinances that had passed there, those sanctuary city ordinances. But because of, you know, sort of, I think, the climate and push in Ohio to protect abortion rights, the city of Lebanon, which had passed that sanctuary city ordinance, actually revised its ordinance rather than continue the legal fight. So that once again just speaks to the power of local advocates and how much organizing can do to stop these bans.
Well, that's really encouraging to hear, and I appreciate you ending on that note. Yeah, I think one of the things you said in particular that resonated with me is the efforts to normalize banning and restricting, and how you know, if you follow the trajectory of how these bills and other abortion bans and restrictions have come up, it's that like slow chipping, oh no, we're going to do something big, and then oh no, here's our compromise that actually isn't a compromise at all. It's still just creating a really terrible atmosphere for people. We had one more question, but I will save it towards the end so that we have time for Andrea's section. And thank you so much. Anyone else who might have questions for Lindsay or for Rosann, please just drop them in the question box and we'll make sure we get them at the end. I'll kick it to Erin and Andrea for now.
Thank you so much. That was outstanding. All right, lucky me, I get to introduce Andrea Grimes, who uses she, her pronouns. Andrea is a writer, editor, and activist living in Austin, Texas with her husband, two unusually small but vocal cats, and an eminently goofy hound dog. Oh, Andrea, the way you write is so awesome. She writes about Texas politics and reproductive justice and often supports sexual and reproductive health organizations, advocates, and funders in their strategic communications work. Her newsletter is Home with the Armadillo, and she's currently publishing a serialized work of experimental horror fiction at revivalweekly.com. Andrea, we are so pleased to have you here. Thank you for making the time.
Thanks so much. I'm thrilled to be here.
Awesome. Well, let's dive right in. So Andrea, what is the role of reporters in covering abortion bans, access, and abortion opponents?
Yeah, so you know, ideally the role of reporters in covering abortion and related issues would be to present first and foremost, an accurate picture of the abortion landscape. Unfortunately, that can be pretty rare these days for a variety of reasons. Newsrooms are being pressured to do more reporting with less. We have fewer reporters who are specializing in issues like abortion and even healthcare. You know, you'll often get somebody who's on the criminal justice beat covering abortion for a day, or somebody who's on the, local government beat tapping into a state level abortion coverage area. So there are a lot of challenges facing folks. But I think, sort of topmost, I think the role of reporters is to resist the impetus to treat abortion as if it is a highly controversial, hot button issue with two equally powerful, equally motivated, equally credible sides. Abortion coverage has traditionally treated the anti-abortion movement and anti-abortion lobbyists and anti-abortion politicians as being as credible and as expert as abortion providers and people who have abortions. And of course, we know that that is not the case. Most Americans are pro-choice. They have been pro-choice for decades. Abortion is only becoming more and more popular with the American public. Anti-abortion lobbyists, politicians, and movement members are in the minority. They have long been in the minority, but you often wouldn't know that purely from seeing mainstream coverage of abortion. So that is a bummer. But there are some ways that I think reporters can really improve abortion coverage. And I think that I'm going to talk about 5 sort of green flags, as it were, when it comes to good abortion coverage, because I think that this looking out for these green flags can help news consumers have a better understanding of which kinds of coverage are the most credible and trustworthy. So I think great abortion reporting, first and foremost, understands how abortion works. Great abortion reporting doesn't conflate medication abortion with procedural abortion, right? Uses accurate language around gestational limits and medications. And great abortion reporting understands that legal risks around self-managed abortion are really sort of the top issue facing self-managed care, not methods or medicines being particularly dangerous. So medically accurate language is really important there. I look for abortion coverage that provides important socio-political context. Abortion bans and restrictions disproportionately harm people experiencing poverty, women and folks of color, LGBTQ people, trans folks, and people at the intersections of those experiences and identities. So I think really good abortion coverage ensures that the stories told reflect folks with direct ties to the communities most affected, and even ideally is produced by people from those communities and from people who have abortions. I also look for coverage that has that uses gender inclusive language, because not everybody who has abortions is a woman. And I also really try to pay attention to illustrations on abortion coverage. I always sort of raise an eyebrow at the photo accompanying, a 6-week abortion ban that will have, a 9-month unembodied pregnant belly as its lead illustration, right? So, I look for those markers of decent abortion coverage, and then I try to privilege consuming that sort of coverage over sort of the more sensational, gotta hear both sides style reporting.
Thank you so much for that, Andrea. And I'm just thinking about how, in the beginning of this call, Lindsay started talking about Jonathan Mitchell. And, one of the other things that he's been up to is drafting language that would even try to make our Reproaction website illegal. And so we're absolutely in a war for information as well. And I'm just really appreciating you lining out for people how to look for quality information and how important that is to this. So my question on these travel bans, so even if bans don't pass, right? Travel bans don't pass or arrests aren't made, what is the impact of states and localities pursuing abortion travel bans on the public? I know we've touched on this a bit with some of the other panelists, but I'd love to hear you go deeper.
Sure, yeah. Really the terrifying thing about these bans is that they needn't ever be implemented in practice to do a lot of the work that they would do if they were implemented, right? Because they are about fomenting fear. I think importantly, I like to refer to these not just as abortion travel bans, but abortion support travel bans, or even abortion support bans, because in a lot of the cases, these ordinances don't merely ban or don't merely provide a private enforcement penalty for folks who might drive a friend or a loved one across Lubbock County for an abortion, but might seek to target folks who donate to abortion funds or to practical support funds. So we're also talking about potentially, going after folks who fund abortion care or who fund support for abortion care, right? So we're not talking solely about hitting the road, right? We're talking about private citizens' ability to spend their own money, right? So that's why I tend to refer to them as abortion support bans. And they really are intended to foment fear and incite terror and uncertainty for and among people who need abortions, and very importantly, for the family, friends, and community members who love and support people who need abortions, which is all of us, right? These bans create a culture of neighbor on neighbor surveillance, complete with a profit incentive, right? The folks behind these bans want us to be creeping on our neighbors. They want us to be afraid of our neighbors. They want us to feel shame and stigma. They want us not to talk about the abortions we have or the abortions we've supported, right? Abortion support travel bans also do some important work for the anti-abortion movement in that they allow these bullies who really stand to benefit monetarily, right, from suing over other people's abortions to pretend like they are instead victims. So it's a real inversion of this sort of bully victim mentality, but the anti-abortion movement very, very much relies on this feigned victimhood, right? So these travel bans allow, your creepy bully neighbor to say, oh, woe is me, I have been harmed by this person's abortion 100 miles away, right? And that's a really important political and mental stance for the anti-abortion movement, and these bans really shore that up. Even though these abortion support bans are ostensibly meant to exempt pregnant people and people who have abortions from being entangled in the criminal or civil legal system, I think we all recognize that in practice, that's not going to be the case. Abortion support bans criminalize pregnant people, and they entangle them in costly and often public legal proceedings, even when pregnant people are technically accepted from being sued for ending their own pregnancies, right? If you're going to sue your neighbor for driving her daughter to have an abortion, you're going to have to prove somehow that that abortion occurred, right? Which is going to take some amount of investigation into people's private medical decisions. So it is, of course, not enough to say on paper that, oh, technically pregnant people are exempted, because pregnant people's private medical decisions are always going to be at the heart of litigating these abortion support bans if in fact they were to go into effect. As Rosann said, a lot of this stuff starts as being tested at the hyper local level, right? But in abortion hostile states, I think it's very possible that we could see abortion hostile legislatures build on some of these hyper local ordinances and, really take those to the next level. It was exciting in Texas to see Nate Johnson file a sort of a Hail Mary bill that would outlaw these abortion support bans, I think more likely we're going to see folks like Briscoe Cain in Texas and allies, at the state level, perhaps try and maximize, right? Really sort of pump up these local bans and maybe try to do something similar at the state level. So that's always a threat as well. But I think most importantly, we really need to remain clear-eyed about the most realistic and pressing threats to abortion access, while staying aware of the cultural and political work that these headline-grabbing abortion support bans do, right? Because there are threats on the ground right now that are much more likely to directly affect folks in terms of abortion access than a private civil action in a county that may be hundreds of miles away, right? We've got the Comstock stuff going on. We've got the mifepristone case, which could be a national, ban on some abortion medication, right? So, I think that we have to remain really clear that, we're not talking about police checkpoints for pregnant people driving across Lubbock tomorrow. We need to make sure that we are aware of the potential of these bans and their threats and the work they do if they're never implemented, while really paying attention and doing our best to combat the existing restrictions and bans on abortion access without, I think, becoming over-focused on some of the more sensational aspects of these support bans.
Thank you for that, Andrea. It is always a pleasure to hear from you. I am going to keep us moving on to next steps, and so we have as much time for Q&A. I do have another question in the hopper for you, Andrea, and we'll get moving to all panelists. Thank you for this. This was outstanding. I'll pass it to Shireen to talk us through how you can connect with us.
Yes, please. So we are on a small select group of social media platforms. You can follow us at Reproaction on all of them. I guess we should be changing that one to X instead of Twitter. We are also technically on Blue Sky, though not quite as active. But you can also sign up for our email alerts. That is a lot more reliable at reproaction.org. And in particular, if you are interested in hosting a house party on self-managed abortion with pills, that is an information session that we put on fairly regularly in virtual and in-person forums. You can sign up at the QR code on the screen. And I'll kick back to you, Erin, for questions.
Thank you. And before we do that, so Shireen encouraged you to sign up for our email list. I absolutely want you to do that because we host these webinars every single month, although we take we host them every single month. We don't want to make sure, or we want to make sure that we're inviting you to them. So if you're on our email list, if you sign up for our email list, you will get the invite. So we do want to encourage you to save the date for our first webinar of 2024. We will be talking about the propaganda of anti-abortion crisis pregnancy centers that try so hard to present themselves as if they were loving and pro-woman. It's actually a big conspiracy and money racket, and they're systematically lying and misleading and shaming people. So we'll dive deep into that. Okay, so I'm going to move over to Q&A. I'm going to start with one that has come in from a listener, and let's start with Rosann on this, and then if anyone else wants to jump in, they're welcome to. But since Comstock has come up a couple of times, could you speak to the potential for a future anti-abortion administration to reinterpret Comstock and read it as fully banning the shipment of medication abortion pills? Is that a threat?
So I think, yeah, it's important to always say everything is possible. Probable, I think, is more the question. So yeah, the risk of Comstock coming back, it could be applied a couple ways. Right now it is, it has been raised by the judge and by Kaczmarek in the ongoing FDA mifepristone litigation. So I think it would be highly unlikely that like a federal anti-abortion administration would just sort of come out swinging with some sort of like legal interpretation that tries to reawaken it. I think they would try to wait and see if that case does that. That being said, as we saw with the US Supreme Court's decision to sort of stay the initial district court action by Kaczmarek that attempted to revive it, I think it's possible. I'm never going to say it's not possible. I think they'd probably want to rely on the courts for that instead of the administration taking it on. That being said, we also have an incredibly anti-abortion House Speaker now, so I would never say something's not possible.
Thank you, indeed. I'm going to go back to Andrea. Andrea, what can people who are not in Texas or people in states where at least we're being told abortion access is safe, that often isn't necessarily true, but regardless, people with more access to abortion than what is happening in Texas, how do they fight back against these proposed travel bans or make conditions better for abortion seekers who are coming into their states from elsewhere?
Yeah, sure. So as you said, I think the number one thing that folks in geographies that are perhaps ostensibly more abortion friendly can do is not presume that your geography will be abortion friendly indefinitely forever. Abortion friendly or friendlier geographies are not that way because they just popped up and that is the natural state of being for California or Oregon, right? Abortion friendlier geographies are the way they are because people in those geographies demand that those places be friendlier to abortion, right? So that is really sort of the number one thing that I would say to folks in blue or coastal areas is don't become complacent. Find out who in your community is already working to demand protections, better protections for abortion access, improvements to abortion access, and get involved with those efforts. Just simply do not presume that the status quo is going to stay, because as we have seen from my fellow panelists, the Mark Lee Dixon and Jonathan Mitchell are not sitting around, just, idly thinking about Texas and New Mexico, right? They're already working in Ohio and Illinois. So, these sorts of support bans are coming anywhere these guys can put, their feet on the ground, really. And broadly, I think that folks everywhere need to take a lot of care to understand what abortion support bans do, what the actual threats of those bans are, who are threatened by those bans, so that we can combat misinformation, right? A lot of the news stories around when some of this was first hitting the news, folks sort of had an immediate reaction that, that abortion travel is banned, right? That they're arresting people for traveling to have abortions, when of course that is not strictly the case, right? And misunderstandings that come out of perhaps well-meaning attempts to rile people up about these issues can really cause a lot of damage to people on the ground, right? We want to make sure that our friends and neighbors across the country understand that it's not illegal to get in your car and drive to have an abortion, right? So we really want to be able to combat that misinformation while again staying clear-eyed about what these bans actually do. And of course, I'm going to be a broken record on this with lots of other folks, but support your local abortion provider, support your local abortion fund, support especially your local practical support fund. So those are the entities that help people with bus tickets and airplane tickets and rides to access abortion. Providers in abortion-friendly geographies are overloaded, they are stressed, they need support because they are acting as sometimes the only access point to abortion for folks coming from Texas and the South and the Midwest. So making sure you're supporting your local providers and your local funds monetarily and with volunteer time if they need it is really, really important.
Hear, hear. And that is, just something to underscore. If there's folks who are listening, or people, or it's you yourself, there is sensationalist reporting about this that leads a misleading impression that if somebody needs or wants to have an abortion that they shouldn't bother trying because it's too hard. That's absolutely untrue. No matter where you live, there are practical support networks and abortion funds working at the local level who are absolutely committed to helping people get the abortions that they need. And I'll even take it a step further that, with people who may be considering self-managing abortion with pills, that there are tons of resources and access to quality information, the World Health Organization protocol, making sure that people know that the power to end their pregnancies safely and effectively can also be in their own hands. We also have that information on our website at reproaction.org. So there's lots of ways to do that. Also, just jumping off another thing that Andrea just shared, Andrea was saying that that places that are considered more friendly to abortion, that happens because people come together and demand it. And I'm really thinking about reflecting again on the awesomeness of Lindsay, talking about, jamming up a meeting. And so for hours, they had people there who were asking questions and being heard. So Lindsay, this is a little bit separate from the travel bans, but not really. The question that I have for you, if you could, because I know we've got so many activists listening, it's just incredible work that you all have done with the Amarillo Reproductive Freedom Alliance. And I think it underscores people can get together and demand better no matter what the prevailing powers that be say. So what are your tips about local organizing and doing this abortion access advocacy work at the grassroots level and supporting other volunteers and coming together?
Sure. So, our alliance came together just in the most beautiful, organic way. We are a group of people who had, either closely or loosely known one another that felt really highly motivated after seeing what was happening. So I would encourage folks to just, find other like-minded individuals and meet together on a regular basis. And as you get to know one another, you will find out what each individual's strength is. Somebody might be really great on the legal side. Somebody might be really great with outreach. Somebody else is the one who can help provide childcare and make sandwiches. There's no wrong way to do it. Just continue to show up, continue to network, and find what each individual's strengths are. And you are so powerful together. And that's really been our guiding light through this, is that, and also that it's okay when you need to step away and take a rest, because you have a group of people who can keep the momentum going, because the burnout is real, the fatigue is real. And by having that group of folks that are committed to the same cause, the forward momentum is going to continue to grow. So I would, ultimately find folks, work together, stay together, support one another.
Outstanding. I think that is just the perfect note to end on. And so I'm going to do that here. Thank you so much to our panelists, to Lindsay, to Rosann, to Andrea. Thank you so much for taking the time and sharing your deep expertise when the world is on fire. Shireen, thank you for putting together this outstanding webinar. Appreciation to each and every one of you. We will be sending out a recording to this to our full email list, as well as folks who RSVP'd. So if you want to see this again, you're more than welcome to. Thank you so much. We'll see you in January. Have a good one. Bye.